Thank you, Michael. That's such a great intro. So I'm going to show you a lot today, and I'll try to zip through it because I really want to have a conversation as well. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, perfect. So Michael did a lot of the work that I was going to do, but my name is Reif Larsen. I'm the founder of the Future of Small Cities Institute, which looks at small and mid-sized cities, and in particularly through a lens of justice and sustainability, which I know a lot of you are working on as well. And I get the question a lot, what's a small city? People are sort of fixated on this population threshold, like what qualifies for a small city. And I tell them it's less about population and a lot about the extenuating circumstances or kind of present factors in a city. So the small city, legacy cities that I look at are often defined by marked decline in manufacturing and workforce that's kind of defined their present day, and that's a process that's begun, sometimes 60, 70 years ago. This in turn has led to a lot of population loss and in particularly a kind of hollowing of what was once a vibrant downtown core, which is relevant to our discussion today. What characterizes small cities today that I come up against again and again is that when you talk to people working in the town, there's everyone's strapped, right? Whether it's they don't have enough money, they're working 4 or 5 jobs, they don't have a planning department, for instance. So what this often leads to is people being really tired, but also interesting collaborations, partnerships. People come up with solutions, as they did in Detroit. And that's one of the things that draws me to small cities, is that there's a lot of innovation going on out of necessity. You also have a lot of infrastructure that is legacy infrastructure that dates back to the time of this kind of industrial heyday, right? So abandoned factories, rail lines going through the city, adjacent space that's vacant. All these were often seen as detriments to these small cities, but through the lens of sustainable planning, they suddenly become assets, right? So that's the kind of paradigm shift that we're in, is that a lot of these kind of deadweight aspects of cities are becoming assets. Another challenge in these small cities is that often they are the county seats. I was just hearing about the strange governance in Massachusetts that done away with your counties, but in New York they're still very much in play and have created this kind of overlapping bureaucracies, which can be challenging at times. That you have a city governance that believes one thing or is of one party, then you have a county, and then in the case of Albany you have another strata, which is the state. And it can often lead to sort of this status quo, culture of status quo, and sort of bureaucratic permission asking, I suppose. In general, the population, I mean, there are aspects of Buffalo that are very similar to Kingston, which is, Buffalo's 250,000, Kingston's 20,000, but because of all the kind of present aspects, they share a lot in common with more so than other 20,000 person cities. So, but this is the general range of cities that we look at, from 20 to 150,000. And not surprisingly, there's a lot of terms for them, and they all have subtle differences. Gateway city is a term that's been thrown a lot around Massachusetts, Rust Belt cities. Mass Design Lab calls them fringe cities. And I think the fact that there's a lot of terms for them shows that we're still grappling with what defines them. They can be slippery. And even the term legacy is, I think, a kind of imperfect term or idea. The Brookings Institute has done a lot of work on this, and they sort of tried to chart where they were. This is not cities, but this is counties that have small cities in them, because a lot of the demographic data is county level. So you can see they're really clustered. Like we're in the heart of it, right? We're right in that dot matrix there. But they're clustered around the kind of Midwest, Northeast, and that's not surprising because this is where a lot of the kind of manufacturing and mills were. And they're sort of less present in the South and the West. But there are a lot of them. And so I think that's one of the reasons why this is really important, is that, first of all, there are many more small cities, but I've seen statistics from anywhere from 1 in 10 people to 3 in 10 people live in a small to mid-sized city in the country. So it affects a lot of the population. Today I want to look at the Hudson Valley. Here we are. It's a little dark, sorry. This is the Hudson corridor that runs up past Troy, and then the Mohawk River connects Schenectady here, and then down here is Kingston. What's interesting is like they're all part of the same watershed, but somewhere about 20 miles south of Troy, people stop considering themselves being in the quote-unquote Hudson Valley, and that stops being the geographic marker, and they start thinking of themselves being in the capital region. So that's an interesting psychogeographic distinction, right? They're still in the Hudson corridor, but for them, the state house in Albany is the true kind of magnetic vector, and also most of these cities, Troy being the exception, have literally cut themselves off from the river. So the river stops being the kind of dominant force, cultural force, and it becomes this kind of political force, which is an interesting distinction. So we'll start in Troy because that's where I live. And Troy, like a lot of these cities, has a really robust history of manufacturing. This is from 1910. I find this picture extraordinary. The manufacturing industry in Troy, it was one of the kind of birthplace of the Industrial Revolution in the area. One among many things they produced is the detachable collar, which was very, very hip at the time. People realized that people were getting their cuffs and their collars very dirty, but not the rest of their shirt, so they would just pop their collar off and wash those. And this was a huge booming industry as soon as someone discovered this. So, I mean, look at this. This streetscape is incredible to me. First of all, look at the telephone poles. They're so high. They're like, 80 feet tall. There's really like robust sidewalks. It's pretty wide. The streets are pretty narrow. There's no cars. And these trolleys would go up and down somewhat dangerously. But there's, it's marked by awnings. And as you can see, like everyone was walking pretty much. You were taking a streetcar, you were walking, maybe you had a horse. And fast forward 100 years to that same corridor. This is the same look. And you can see that urban renewal has come through, taken a lot of the buildings away. It's a lot more open, and the car is now the dominant kind of feature, right? So the roadways are quite large. The sidewalks have shrunken. A lot of the manufacturing industry is gone, but some of it still remains. You can see some factories in the background. So this is the kind of archaeological amalgamation that these cities are dealing with. But I just wanted to show you how these streetscapes change over time. That street that we were looking at is River Street right there. And you can see how it's been a little hollowed out, right? It's no longer that kind of major main street thoroughfare. And that's what also happens over time, right? The main street sort of migrates. The main street today, I would say, is further south on River Street and at this intersection of River Street and Broadway. This is where, if you ask people from Troy where the main streets are, this is where all the kind of shops are congregated. Troy for a long time had a really down and out period where the downtown was sort of abandoned. A lot of vacancy. And then about 10 years ago, someone opened a wine bar downtown. People said, you can't open a wine bar in downtown Troy, you're crazy. They did it. It was fine. It was great, in fact. And after that, there was an explosion of smaller shops and restaurants. I think right before the pandemic, there were something like 60 restaurants in Troy. So it went through this kind of, quote-unquote, downtown revitalization that we've heard about a lot. I think one of the assets that the downtown Troy does is that it's a relatively compact space. It's about 16 square blocks. It's manageable, it's walkable. There are a range of retail spaces that are small enough that a pop-up shop or a startup shop can start in it. Interestingly, it has these little alleyways that they are just starting to figure out what to do with them. This is you see these in a lot of small cities in town. This is where like the waste was picked up. And until very recently, that's exactly what was happening in Troy. Troy also, I think one of the saving graces of Troy was that they largely avoided the kind of huge destruction of urban renewal that laid waste to a lot of cities. So the primary space that got bulldozed was this little corridor here. And like a lot of other projects, and we'll talk about this a bit, they bulldozed it and then didn't do anything with it for about 15 years. So there was just like a hole in the city. They built a mall called this Uncle Sam Atrium. Uncle Sam is supposedly from Troy, and he's like the son of Troy, for better or worse, and they built a parking garage, because this was when they were trying to import malls into cities. The mall is empty, the parking garage is unstable, and so it's this kind of big hole that they're trying to just decide what to do in Troy. So it's a familiar story. This right here is the stretch of Broadway that I have been drawn to over the pandemic, and probably a lot of you have watched the transformation of main streets. The experimentation that's gone on, right, with relatively simple and cheap materials, painting the street slowly being taken over by outdoor eateries, right, ordinance laws changing, cities suddenly that were before not flexible at all, suddenly being forced to be flexible, work with private businesses. And on the fly, literally, people are kind of figuring out what are streets, right? Are they places where we store our automobiles? Are they places for people? Are they quasi-private places where you have to be able to afford a meal to use? Are they public spaces? And that kind of negotiation, I think, it has put this question of what is a main street and what do we want our streets to look like front and center. So a lot of cities are grappling with, well, do we keep this kind of outdoor eateries, make them permanent? What do we do? How do we change the laws? Do we have to change zoning? It's a really rich question right now. Someone asked me, so what is a main street? What is the definition? And I was like, it's one of those things where you know it when you see it, but then you don't really know, what is the definition? So I'm a novelist. I'm interested in the origin of words. I looked it up for you, good people, and I only had more questions. So Main Street, noun. 1, the principal street of a small town. Okay, not sure what that means. 2, the sections of a country centering about its small towns. So Main Streets has become this expansive definition that's not just a street, but like a place, a state of mind, right? A place of environment characterized by materialistic, self-complacent provincialism. It's like we are getting very psychological here. It's like, okay, we're diagnosing the American mindset. And then the fictionalist in me loves this C, middle America, sense 3. It's very abstract, and you could write a whole novel that was the title. But also, it's old. It's an old term, right? The idea of a main street has been around for a while and has obviously changed with multiple advents of going from a walking city to a horse city to a streetcar city to a car city to now we're reinventing that terminology again. And it's deeply ingrained in the consciousness of America, right? When you go to Disney World, you enter through Main Street USA. So it's taken on this kind of, ersatz mythology of its own. We don't even really know what a main street is. We know the feeling of a main street, but it's very disconnected from the actual reality on the ground. This great thinker, Mindy Fulalove, she has been called a city shrink in that she has a background trained in psychology, and she brings that to neighborhoods, to community. She's written a number of books, including Root Shock, and she sort of diagnoses these spaces as psychological spaces, which I think is a really helpful analysis. And her distinction was really helpful for me. She said, we can compare Main Street behaviors to mall behaviors. Malls, useful as they are for shopping, flirting, and eating ice cream, do not permit protests, panhandling, or lounging against a building. Malls are not public spaces, and peoples and activities that are not acceptable can be excluded. Main streets are civic spaces belonging to we the people. We are reasonably free to express ourselves in the spaces we own. So I keep coming back to this, right? That they're essentially civic spaces, even as they're fraught civic spaces, right? In America, we don't do public space that well. We don't generally have the beautiful piazzas and plazas of Europe because, well, we were built around, private property and so forth. So the main streets function for a lot of cities in the absence of that kind of town square. And yet they become this really kind of fraught collision of commercialism, retail, transport, and public space. They have to kind of function in all these ways. So yes, they belong to we the people, but they also have to function as, well, where we get milk, where we drive our car, where we store our car. And in that sense, I think that bulge, what we're asking them to do and function all these ways, they get strained, and we felt that, right? Recently, the transport element has won out. We're very happy to cede most of Main Street to the storage of automobiles. That's For years and years, that was like, great, we can park. I can park in front of where I get a drink. People get very angry if they have to walk more than a block, right? And now we're starting to renegotiate that. Maybe we were willing to walk a block, maybe 2 blocks, you know? Maybe on those 2 blocks, I see something else. So this is what cities are negotiating. Dr. Fullalove also came up with some terminology that's been really helpful for me to think about some of the main streets that I look at. So there's 4 of them. She says that, you know, good main streets are characterized by these assets. The box, right? The box, the closed-in box where we feel comfortable. We feel the boundaries. When you're walking down a tight main street, we feel this edge, we feel this edge, and we as humans, we don't like being in open spaces, right? We want to see a wall here, a wall here. We feel comfortable like that. So the idea of a kind of contained box is important for Main Street. Main streets are healthy when they are connected and have a connection to the surrounds, right? If no one lives around Main Street, then it's hard for people to come there. But if it's surrounded by people and there's a lot of different connections to the Main Street, the kind of the circle around Main Street is also important. She talks about a Main Street essentially is a thoroughfare. It's a place from one place to another. You have to have a line going through it. People have to have a reason to move through it. That kind of flow is really important. It can't just be a nothing, right? It has to have purposefulness to it. And then finally, she talks about, you know, main streets, as cities and towns have grown up, there's a tangle of these main streets. So you might have, you know, a city might have 2 or 3 different spots, main streets, and they're all kind of interfacing and communicating with each other. And it's important to see those nodes in a network. So these 4 elements, I'll use this terminology to kind of analyze some of the main streets that we're looking at. So I want to start our journey in Schenectady, which is a fascinating small city. It used to have 100,000 people. It's lost about 40% of its population. Its heyday was, I would say, 1930, 1940. This is what it is. It's along the Mohawk River. The downtown is here. And the dominant force for many, many, many years, still is, one could argue, is it was the headquarters of General Electric. And you can see just from this aerial how dominant that force is, right? It's like a shark taking a bite out of the city. The highway weaves around it. It's really, it's a huge influence and still remains a huge influence. The other major industry was American Locomotive. They built trains here. That left, and that was a brownfield site that has just recently been developed. So downtown Schenectady went through a huge period of disinvestment. This is the main street, State Street. And in the last 20 years, there's been a lot of money poured in, primarily through their economic development agency, which is called Metroplex, and is the envy of a lot of cities and towns. Metroplex is a quasi-public entity that takes money from the county. It takes, I think, it's half a percentage of state county tax funds Metroplex, which is then poured back into the city. So it's a model that is oddly not used as much as it should be, because Schenectady, the city of Schenectady, has really benefited from it. And a lot of the focus has been on State Street. They've done a lot of interventions. The problem was they were dealing with decades and decades and decades of disinvestment. These are all the surface parking lots surrounding State Street. A lot of them were the result of urban renewal projects that never happened. And here's City Hall. And in particular, there's this infamous, it's even bigger than this, it was called the 22 blocks that was razed. Post-war in Schenectady, there was this huge city planning resurgence called the Town of Tomorrow. And it was part of a larger kind of cultural trend at that time of importing the idea of a mall, which were starting to pop up in the suburbs, into the city. Well, we don't want people to go to the suburbs to have a mall, so why don't we just bring those malls right into the city? So this was like what people were drooling over. You can see, I think I have a laser. Oh, look at that. That's City Hall there. So this was going to be that area of they were just going to build a mall, and this was getting people very excited. So as soon as they came up with the plans, what happens is they're like, great, this is a blighted area. We're going to bulldoze it. And even before you bulldoze, once you target an area as a site of redevelopment, the property values drop. People don't want to live there. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So there's City Hall. So that area in Schenectady lay vacant for decades and decades. And of course, what happens, and David Hockfelder pointed this out, is that particularly in small cities, it's not true across the board, these projects started, but then they ran out of money a lot of times. So in a lot of cities, they would raise something and they would destroy it and they wouldn't build back. Or what they would build back was not what they originally planned or didn't meet the needs of what they were talking about. So the urban renewal in small cities is just starting to be explored, but it's a hugely destructive force that is still shaping kind of policy in main streets today. So I wanted to give you a little trot down State Street, and you can see, as good urban planners, that there's been a lot of interventions, right? They've taken the thoroughfare and they've put angled parking, they've put islands, they've put bump outs, there's bike shares, they've put on a road diet, they've put it down to one way each way. Proctor's Theater is right there. It's become the kind of creative hub of the city. The people would point to Proctor's, the resurgence of Proctor's really being responsible for the resurgence of State Street. And there's a lot of shops and so forth, but it still, I think, suffers from not as much people living right around State Street, and that's just because a lot of the parking lots are there. There's infill, there's going on, but it doesn't. The circle could be stronger around it, and they've done their best to kind of make the box and make it walkable, but they're struggling with some of the pieces in place. Another thing I wanted to draw your attention to is this also happened right around, I would say, 2008. They put in a pedestrian mall, and Michael and I were talking about the fraught history of pedestrian malls, and probably some of you have studied pedestrian malls. They were all the rage in the 70s, and people wanted to do pedestrian malls everywhere, and a lot of them were torn out 7 years later. So what are some of the characteristics of the pedestrian malls that have succeeded? One, they're usually pretty short, and you can see J Street is 1 block long. Two, people have a purpose for using them. They're usually going to someplace. So here, City Hall to State Street, people are actually using them. Three, there's a young population, right, that can actually walk. If you have a lot of these small cities, the population is getting older and older, so people don't want to go down a pedestrian mall. So J Street, I would argue, is one that is a pedestrian mall that functions well. And you can see one of the reasons I think it functions well is that there's a lot of stores, there's a lot of reasons to go there. It's a box, it's functioning with a box, it's a thoroughfare, and they've kind of created that mini circle around it. There's theories of kind of urban planning that people like entrances, a lot of entrances, right? So I call this a box with many doors, right? Alan Jacobs said, many entrances make for great streets. So J Street is an example of that. There's the downtown core, but what you see in a lot of these cities is these approach roads that were state roads, and these are the roads that actually go through the neighborhoods. But they've been dominated by cars. They become high-speed car corridors. But a lot of businesses are sited around them. So these kind of auxiliary main streets you probably recognize them in your own city. I wanted to take a kind of case study look at Crane Street in Mont Pleasant. Mont Pleasant's a really interesting neighborhood. It was a middle-class neighborhood right adjacent to General Electric. That's the General Electric campus right there. General Electric moved a lot of its facilities to the suburbs. The workforce left. The property values plummeted in Mont Pleasant. There's a lot of vacant properties. It has one of the highest vacant property rates in the whole of Schenectady. You've heard this cycle, right? So there's been a lot of disinvestment here. It's now a primarily African-American, low-income community. But the corridor is still there, and there's a lot of important restaurants and services along Crane Street. But it's been neglected, right? It's not really, if you talk to a lot of people, they wouldn't say that it's a main street, but these actually are the main streets that are really important to low-income communities. And Schenectady just released a kind of Crane Street redevelopment and revitalization plan. But as we take our little stroll down Crane Street, you probably recognize a lot of the, tried to go down Crane Street. You probably recognize a lot of features, right? It's a kind of tattered box. There's people walking, but there's no crosswalks. It's not designed for people. It's designed for cars. There's vacant lots. it's not really a place that you want to hang out with long, right? It's not, although, there's essential services along these plots. So I think when we talk about the future of main streets, we shouldn't just talk about downtown corridors. We should be talking a lot about the crane streets and the Broadways, which we'll see in Kingston. I want to give you one more example of main streets right now, because you probably also recognize this model, and it's in the old American locomotive factory space. This was a huge high-profile project that became the Rivers Casino and Mohawk Harbor development. So it was a former brownfield site that got redeveloped from scratch. Everyone's thought that the casino was going to be the kind of second coming and the joy of Schenectady, and it hasn't quite lived up to its billing. And this is what it looks like. They want to build a whole nother sort of retail office complex on the other kind of finger here. They have a whole little harbor. That's why it's called Mohawk Harbor. And they've built a sort of main street. And if you look at a lot of the features here, it's like what urban planners would like, right? There's a bike path. They put most of the parking in hidden parking garages. There's wide sidewalks. We have the box present, but we don't have the line. Where are you going from where to where? And the circle is really weak. It's a kind of homogeneous circle, right? It's for people who live and work there, which kind of violates the tenets of Jane Jacobs' kind of robust, the sidewalk is a collision point for many people of many classes and ideas and backgrounds. This is a sort of broken Main Street in a way, or it's a sort of invented Main Street. So it's a challenge. The developers did the best they could, right? They wanted a kind of civic meeting grounds, but something is not quite working in this alchemy. Some of the answers to the problems that I pose here, I think actually we can find in Kingston, which is a much kind of smaller model, but they don't have a metroplex, but they have a really engaged mayor and town city council who are doing all kinds of work. So the layout of Kingston is quite challenging, and you may know of a city that has a similar kind of challenging aspect. There's actually three distinct kind of cores. There's uptown, there's the downtown, which is on the river, the roundout, and then they have this kind of long connective tissue, which people kind of optimistically call Midtown, but which is really just a long street called Broadway. So uptown is a beautiful place, but it's really small, and the main street there is called Wall Street. It's about, I would argue, 4 square blocks. And this is the other thing, that small cities, do they have the population, do they have the infrastructure to actually support that kind of robust, dense, walkable main streets? Can you have a 4-block downtown? And if you do, how do you kind of nurture it and keep that density and walkability? The challenge also that Kingston has had in the past is that, and you probably recognize this, the mall culture is right there adjacent. If you need an item, you can just park your car and go to the mall. Why would you walk to Main Street where you might not find parking and the hours might be not, you know that Jiffy Lube is there, or Hannaford or whatever it is. There's a familiarity to it. So the kind of the battle of retail is playing out kind of right adjacent. Wall Street's really beautiful, and I moved to Saugerties, which is just adjacent to Kingston, in 2009, and I was kind of really rooting for uptown Kingston. It has this kind of almost a southern New Orleans kind of vibe to it. The box is very much present. The question of, is the circle and the line present? Could uptown Kingston support a workable Main Street is a real question. The retail spaces, and this often happens in small streets, are awkward. They're kind of narrow but super long. They're the old department stores. So if you're a startup business, rent was cheap, but it was hard to kind of make it work. There's the huge question of seasonality in these small. You might work for the summer, but in the winter it becomes quite lean. This changed pretty rapidly, I would say, in the last 5 years in Kingston. For a long time, they did their best. They did all kinds of programming. But what's happened in the last 5 years is there's been a run, and this was accelerated in the pandemic, on property in downtown Kingston, in uptown Kingston, I should say. And a lot of people from the city came in and bought these things kind of sight unseen. So this is an example of a property that, if you're a startup small business, what do you do with an old bank building? There's a vault in the back, and in very low income main streets, what you see is landlords will come in and they'll rent out the apartments on the top 2 floors. And if the storefront is at all kind of questionable, too big, needs redevelopment, they'll just leave it empty, and they can make a profit by just renting out the top 2 floors. So there's little incentive to actually have a storefront. So if the property values are too low, you have to kind of hit this threshold where it's worth the landlord's time to actually have a commercial space, and you have to have that sweet spot. Kingston has kind of moved to this weird place where their entire downtown is bought up now, and people are opening things like the Hotel Kinsley that by people from New York City who redeveloped the meatpacking district, and they saw, oh, we can buy all this for very cheap. So I talked to the mayor of Kingston. They're very nervous about what's going to happen to Uptown Kingston. Is it going to be a kind of palace for the rich, kind of New York City North, or a lot of the work that they've done to make an inclusive Main Street, the mayor said we can only kind of do so much. At the end of the day, the developers still have a lot of power. So that's an interesting thing that's unfolding in some of these streets, which have cities that have seen a lot of development. What I've been really interested in is Midtown, because this is the conundrum that a lot of cities have, and you probably recognize this. This is Broadway, right? So it's a double lane each way. Again, this is adjacent to a lot of communities. People live here. It's a tattered box, right? It's not a walkable place, but there's great restaurants. You can get like a great cup of coffee there if you know where to look, but you wouldn't want to walk there. You would want to drive there, and so the town is making a really concerted effort to actually make this a place where you want to be, where you want to walk, where you can have multimodal forms of transport. Their solution towards connecting these 3 kind of disparate downtown areas is really interesting. So they want to, one, do what you've seen in a lot of small cities, which is put Broadway on a road diet, right? So get rid of the double lanes going each way, and for them, widen the sidewalks, take it down from 4 lanes to 2. They are doubling down on bicycles. For them, bicycles are the way that they want to invigorate these places, slow people down, make them experience the storefronts. And this is part of a much larger master plan called the Kingston Green Line, where they're creating all kinds of bicycle routes. And I talked to the mayor, and he's like, for us in some ways, the bicycle trail is our new Main Street. We want shops to literally open up on a bicycle trail and almost only be accessible on the bike trail. So that, playing with that kind of idea of maybe we have the wrong kind of transport, and in a small city, how do we pivot away from cars? And that's kind of being played out as we speak. I went there last week to see how they were doing. Of course, everything was delayed by COVID. And you can see they're almost complete with some of these interventions. The bike trail was not open. They had it closed. And you can see they've widened the sidewalk. But the place is still wide open. It's a challenge they have. The box is not closed. I saw people walking about, but it's a dilemma that cities have. How do we make these places places of density, I guess, that you want to walk and experience the storefronts? The Times had a great piece on Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, where they did a sort of granular taxonomy of each storefront and interviewed each storefront owner. And so I walked along Broadway and did that, and we're just kind of close reading the storefronts, and I really recommend you just doing that. Pick a main street that you know and just read the storefronts, particularly during COVID and as we're kind of hopefully getting post-COVID or quasi-post-COVID. Storefronts are a sort of palimpsest of storytelling. Like this Asian grocery store, which is now Sultana's Closet USA. And you can't read it, but they've posted fall hours, but winter hours are open. So it's like this, the question mark of what's going to happen in winter was kind of being played out. The entrance is on the side because this is where someone lives. This is a cafe and restaurant called Pact, which has become a sort of de facto Black Lives Matter anti-racist bulletin board. These storefronts have become these kind of meeting spaces where people meet and exchange ideas. This is a great place called Lunch Nightly, and they've co-opted the kind of shingle outside to declare that their relevancy and their livelihood. We're still here. This is an alarm store that has no storefront, which I thought was interesting, that they're keeping you safe by not interfacing with you at all. And I saw a lot of these sort of transformational experimental storefronts. This is an arts, a gallery space that has been taken over. This is a Tilda's Kitchen, community kitchen, that also has a community space here. That is this kind of civic space, a living room for the city. And this got me interested in what is the future of these storefronts. Once you start looking, there's a whole typology of storefronts. And we're experts at reading storefronts. We don't realize it, like we're experts at reading faces. If you walk by a storefront, you just watch yourself kind of read it. There's a whole study about people trust a storefront if the font on the sign is very small. The larger the font, people kind of distrust the product, which is interesting. We make all kinds of assumptions walking by a storefront and how the signage works, how much it comes out into the street. So that's very interesting. So I've gotten interested in, what is the future of these ground floor spaces, particularly as we're moving away potentially from this kind of single occupancy retail, that kind of like Urban Outfitters model. In Troy, the renaissance a lot of people would point to is the farmers market, which is now becoming ubiquitous. But we shouldn't overlook its kind of revolutionary take on the streetscape, right? It's cheap, it's a pop-up space, a farm can have a kiosk very easily. It's immediately asks us to rethink the street. It's a takeover, and every Saturday, 17,000 people went to downtown Troy in a way that they'd never done. So that immediately got people in that space. Another thing that we're starting to see is this idea of stackable retail, where you have retail inside of retail. It's really hard for some retail shop to just have the whole place. So this is an example of a craft brewery called 518. Took part of their store and made it a local chocolate shop called Primo Botanica. So it's this kind of Russian Matryoshka doll of retail. And you're starting to see that pop-up shops that will feature a number of different retailers kind of combining forces, the collaborative model. In Troy, there's a kitchen incubator called Troy Kitchen, which again allowed a sort of kiosk for these kitchens. They don't want a full brick and mortar space, but they want to kind of try things out. And a lot of these places actually graduated to have their own restaurant. And they do live music and comedy. So this kind of, again, sort of indoor, year-round kiosk culture. The rise of the maker space and the co-working space, we've seen this a lot. This is Troy Tech Valley Center of Gravity, which hosts all kinds of programming for kids. They also do co-working there. I think one of the keys that these places are seeing is that they can't just sort of open their doors. They have to have a robust set of programs to keep people coming in the door. The way that you have foot traffic coming in and out, it's not just you're selling a product. You have to have this kind of programmed experience, which unfortunately takes a lot of work, as Michael knows. Having started his own makerspace in Springfield, that to keep the lights on, but also to keep it contributing to that kind of civic space of the Main Street, people have to have a reason to go there. They have to have a reason to track that line to your space. Alleyways are really interesting too, because they're boxes without a lot of times storefronts. So to activate them, and as I said, Troy is this is the first alleyway they've activated called Franklin Alley. It takes a different kind of intervention, right? A lot of people have used public art, murals, but again, we're finding this out in Troy. They did this beautiful intervention in Franklin Alley, and then they're like, oh wait, we have to give a reason for people to go there, so we're slowly figuring out how to program things. Chattanooga did a really interesting series of installations called Passageways that were meant to be temporary, but people loved them so much that they sort of had to do a whole new round of them. But suddenly it changes the streetscapes, and it changes the relationship to the main streets that it often abuts. So alleyways are a really interesting kind of perpendicular entryway into these main streets. I'm just interested in, what is the future models of these retail. The idea of a third place being an alternate to your home or your work has been around for a long time. But we have to, I guess, be smarter about what these third places are. This is a board game cafe where you can buy a board game, you can meet people. It's an experiential place that people are drawn to that they, importantly, can't get online, right? So that's the competing interest. The last thing I wanted to highlight is the phenomenon of urban rooms, which are taking off in the UK. These are literal living rooms where people can come in and sort of debate the future of storefronts. I know this would go over well in landscape and architecture and regional planning space, but they're kind of rethinking the idea of a storefront using storefronts. So this is a very fancy space that's going to be opened in Newcastle called the Farrell Center. But there's much more modest rooms that are all across, all across the UK that are just basically spaces of debate, of conversation, and they're a really novel use of just a storefront, inviting people in to kind of think about their cities in ways that they might not otherwise. Sometimes cities struggle to have that kind of living room space. We're opening one in Troy called the Focus Lab. We're taking over an old jewelry store, and I'm working with a group of RPI students to design the first exhibition space there on waterfronts. And I'm also working with a group of students and Michael here to hopefully design the second or third exhibition on Main Streets. So we had our first meeting with the students in the space. They took measurements and are thinking about how to activate this kind of pop-up exhibition space, which is really exciting. And then I just want to end, again on Dr. Fulleylove's words, because as we develop and as we think about all these experiential spaces, I'm coming back into this idea of what is a civic space and what is an inclusive civic space, right? We have to make sure that main streets remain places where a lot of people are welcome, and that they don't become these kind of gentrified playgrounds for, post-megapolis wealthy people. And this takes a lot of work, as I was kind of mentioning Kingston. To nurture small city downtowns takes work. And people are finding in particular, coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement, that having a kind of active and robust source of government funding, particularly for women and minority-owned businesses, is really crucial. This is one way. There are a number of ways to make interventions early so that these spaces remain inclusive and remain diverse. But it's a challenge, and it's an ongoing challenge. But there's a lot of really interesting work in places like Kingston. They're opening community-owned co-ops and so forth. So this is a whole nother lecture that we could get into next time. But I know I've run a little long, but I'll end there. And if you have questions, yeah.